welcome to the third part of the biochemistry lessons. This time we're talking about oxidative phosphorylation, which is the process where the vast majority of ATP within aerobic respiration is generated. And this is done by transferring electrons from molecules like FADH2 and NADH to oxygen. Let's dive into it. So we've talked about glycolysis and the citric acid cycle before. So I hope you're familiar with them because this is the basis for understanding what's going to happen here. Oxidative phosphorylation is also called electron transfer chain, which makes sense because we're transferring electrons. Like with the citric acid cycle, this process takes place in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And now we're talking about the basic idea. The basic, very, very basic idea is that by pumping protons out of the matrix into the inner membrane of the mitochondria, a pH gradient is generated, which in turn activates Atpase Synthase, which is an enzyme, or basically it's a protein complex, and in a rotor-like movement, ATP is generated. For oxidative phosphorylation, we have two main parts. The first one is oxidizing FADH and NADH, which means that energy is generated by losing electrons. So now we've got complex names for different protein complexes. So we've got the first complex is the so-called NADH coenzyme Q Oxidoredictase. This complex consists of 46 subunits and they're not all fully characterized in humans. So yes, here NADH is oxidized by ubiquinone, which is also called the coenzyme 2. And via this process, 4 protons are pumped into the mitochondrial membrane, which is of course very important, but the exact mechanism is not known. Complex 2, this succinate Q oxidoredictase, is another complex and an entry point for FAD, which is then oxidized via another reaction, which is succinate to fumarate, and therefore the other proteins produce ubiquinol, so QH2. The third complex is the Q Cytochrome C Oxidase, where ubiquinol reacts with 2 cytochrome C molecules. And here again, 4 protons are pumped into the mitochondrial membrane. The fourth complex is the Cytochrome C Oxidase, where now the reduced form of cytochrome reacts with oxygen. And actually that's the reason why we are breathing, because we need in our mitochondria, and basically that's the only reason why we are breathing. So such complex processes it's for generating water. So now to the second part, we now have an electrochemical gradient. So the outside of the mitochondrial membrane carries a positive charge, whereas the inside carries a negative charge. If the gradient is strong enough, a protein complex called, as I mentioned before, the Atpase Synthase is activated. This can be seen as the fifth complex. And it's very special because it's found in all domains of life and it functions nearly identically. During oxidative phosphorylation, 26 ATPs are generated. And in general, via aerobic respiration, 30 ATPs are generated. So that's really the vast majority of all the ATPs. And as I mentioned before, oxygen is required for this reaction. And if there's no oxygen, basically fermentation replaces the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation and produces only 2 ATPs. So oxidative phosphorylation really is very, very useful for cells as so much more ATP is generated. And that's the main goal. A lack of oxygen can be found physiologically, for example, when we're doing sports, where we then generate lactic acid, and for a long time they thought that this was the reason for sore muscles, but actually they think it's about microfractures. Well, so that's it with oxidative phosphorylation. I hope you enjoyed this video and see you for the next lecture.